She stood at my gate in a silk dress and gold-rimmed glasses, speaking like she was reading a resolution into the official congressional record. You will sign the transfer papers next week. My son needs a recovery space. I looked at her, looked at the calm waters of Cedar Lake, then back at her. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating off this woman was almost impressive. She really thought she could just point at my father's house and take it. What she didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with a former construction engineer who knew exactly how to weaponize a 1973 land survey. She thought she was evicting a pushover. She had no idea I was about to trap her entire HOA operation behind 6 feet of cold, hard steel. But to understand how we got to the point of a massive steel cage match in the middle of a quiet lakeside community, you have to understand the bait. It all started with my father's cabin. My dad built that place in the 1970s with his own 2 hands. Every beam, every uneven floorboard, every window facing the lake meant something to him. He chose that specific lot for the morning light. When I inherited it 11 years ago, I maintained it exactly the way he would have wanted. I replaced the dock planks. I repaired the siding. I never once imagined I would have to defend the property from a neighborhood cartel trying to steal it out from under me. Inside, hanging near the front door, my father had framed the original land survey from 1973. Yellowed at the edges. County stamped. Precisely measured. At the time, I thought it was just one of his retired engineer quirks. I didn't know it would soon become the most dangerous weapon in the house. I was fixing the 3rd wooden step on my dock when I heard the sound of heels on my gravel driveway. Not the casual crunch of a neighbor stopping by to say hello. These were deliberate, heavy footsteps. The kind made by someone who already believes they own the ground they are walking on. That was Marion Chadwick, the HOA president. And trailing right behind her was her 30-year-old son, Bryce, a guy carrying the permanent expression of a man who had never once been told the word no in his entire life. Bryce barely even looked at me. He was already studying the porch, the dock, the shoreline. He was mentally rearranging my property. Marion started speaking without even pretending this was a conversation. She told me she was presenting a community reallocation proposal under the HOA guidelines. She went on and on about Bryce needing a recovery-oriented living environment. She actually used the phrase equitable redistribution of underutilized community assets, like that meant anything in plain English. I asked her which specific article in the HOA governing documents gave her that authority. She waved her hand dismissively. She said the board had already reviewed the framework and that it wasn't productive to get into the weeds. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I went inside, grabbed my official deed and the actual HOA bylaws I had pulled from the county recorder's office months ago, and laid them on the porch rail. I pointed to my property boundary. Then I pointed to the tree line. She didn't even look down. She stared past the papers at the lake, treating my legal ownership as a minor inconvenience to her preferred view. I told her the conversation was over and went back inside. I watched through the window as they walked back to her silver sedan. She was already aggressively dialing her phone before she even opened the car door. I watched her pull away, thinking this was just another power-tripping HOA board member with a god complex. But when I pulled the county parcel records later that night, my blood ran cold. This wasn't just a delusion. It was a highly calculated land grab, and I was looking right at the paper trail of her previous victims. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of black coffee and pulled parcel histories for every lot in the Cedar Lake Association. 47 properties total. By 3 a.m., the pattern wasn't just obvious, it was glaring. Over the past 5 years, 11 properties had gone through these so-called voluntary easement transfers or covenant modifications. Strips of private land, quietly moving out of homeowner ownership. 7 of those transfers ended up in the exact same place. A holding company called Lakeview Corridor Development Partners. The registered agent? Bryce Chadwick. This was never about a mother trying to find a peaceful lakefront retreat for her son. This was a systematic land assembly operation, cleverly disguised as routine HOA governance. The documents laid out exactly why my property mattered. My cabin sat directly on a piece of shoreline that made their geometry work. Without my parcel, they couldn't create the continuous lakefront footage required to pull a commercial development permit. My dad's cabin wasn't just a nice-to-have. It was the linchpin. The next afternoon, Eleanor Voss knocked on my door. Eleanor was 71. She lived right near the HOA office, and she carried that specific kind of exhaustion you only see in people who have been confused and bullied for way too long. They begin to doubt their own memory. She sat at my table, trembling slightly, and slid a manila folder across the wood. 14 months earlier, Marion had convinced her to sign what she thought was a simple consent form to plant some privacy hedges near her side fence. 3 months later, Eleanor received a massive invoice for maintenance on land she supposedly no longer owned. Buried beneath the legal jargon was a transfer of a 4,000-square-foot strip of her backyard directly into a private maintenance trust. She had signed away a piece of her life without even realizing it. I wrote down the name of the trust, the notary, the date. I told Eleanor she wasn't crazy, and more importantly, she wasn't alone. I needed fresh boundary markers, so I drove into town to pick up some heavy-duty survey stakes. I was standing in the lumber aisle of the local hardware store when I smelled expensive cologne cutting through the scent of sawdust. It was Bryce. He stepped into my aisle, intentionally blocking the exit. He didn't have his mother there to do the talking this time, so he decided to try and play the enforcer. He looked at the stakes in my cart, let out a condescending little laugh, and leaned against the rack. "You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be," he said, adjusting a designer watch that cost more than a reliable truck. "You're holding up progress. That cabin is a teardown anyway. You can't afford to fight the board, and you definitely can't afford to keep that rotting wood standing." I didn't immediately respond. I just looked at him. I spent 30 years in commercial construction. I know how to read a man by the way he stands on concrete. I looked at his $300 boots that had never touched mud. I looked at his perfectly manicured hands. "You don't build things, Bryce," I finally said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "You don't know how to frame a wall, you don't know how to pour a footing, and you sure as hell don't know how to intimidate a man who does. You just sign papers your mother prints out for you." His smug smile vanished. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy. He opened his mouth to say something, realized he had absolutely nothing to back it up, and practically stormed out of the store. I went home and drove those survey stakes deep into the ground along my exact, legal property lines. I wanted them visible. I wanted them undeniable. Marion retaliated exactly 12 hours later. Before sunrise, a notice appeared taped to my front door. Printed on official HOA letterhead, it cited Article 14b. It claimed my survey markers were unauthorized exterior construction and ordered me to remove them within 72 hours or face a daily fine of $200. There was just one fatal flaw in her little power play. Article 14b didn't exist. I didn't call her to argue. I didn't post an angry rant on Facebook. I drove straight down to the county clerk's office and pulled the fully recorded, legally binding amendments on file for the Cedar Lake Association. Nothing created an Article 14b. Nothing gave the HOA authority to stop a titled landowner from marking their own legally surveyed boundaries. By 11:40 that morning, I had a written statement from the county clerk confirming exactly that. I went back to the cabin and drafted my response. No emotion, no dramatic speeches, just the cold, hard facts. I included a copy of the real governing documents, the clerk's written statement, and a side-by-side comparison explicitly highlighting the fraudulent nature of her notice. I mailed it certified, requiring a signature. I kept the receipt. I had outsmarted them on paper. I had exposed their fake rules, and I genuinely thought the threat of the law would be enough to make them back down. I was wrong. The next afternoon, I walked into my cabin and found my dead wife's memory box pried open on the living room floor. I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the floor. The cedar box had belonged to my wife, Catherine. It held the smallest things she cared about near the end of her life. A folded letter, a pressed flower, a silver coin from the year we were married. Whoever had entered my house hadn't smashed anything. They hadn't stolen the TV. They had taken Catherine's things out and arranged them on the floor in a loose semicircle beneath the shelf. Displayed, like a warning, and sitting right in the middle of my kitchen table, held down by a salt shaker, was a single sheet of paper. A property transfer agreement. Typed, complete, and already signed by Marion Chadwick on the seller's line. The buyer fields were left completely blank, just waiting for my signature. It was psychological warfare. A message that they could touch the things I loved anytime they wanted. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. I knelt down, picked up Catherine's things one by one, and put them exactly back where they belonged. I closed the lid. I placed it back on the shelf. Then, I sat down and looked at that transfer agreement for 4 straight minutes. Up until that moment, I was treating this like a real estate dispute. That was my mistake. This wasn't a dispute anymore. It was an extermination. First call, the sheriff's office to file a formal break-in report. Second call, Patricia, a bulldog of an attorney who specialized in community association law. I told her to start preparing a package for a prosecutor. Fraud, burglary, intimidation. All of it. 2 days later, the puzzle cracked wide open. Greg Salter, The former HOA secretary left me a nervous voicemail asking to meet outside the neighborhood. We met at a greasy diner 12 miles east of Cedar Lake. Greg looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. He slid a padded envelope across the sticky table. Marion had pushed him off the board after he started asking questions about a $22,000 reserve fund line item with absolutely zero invoices attached to it. Inside that envelope were photocopied minutes from 11 secret HOA meetings. Sessions held long after official adjournment, sometimes with only 3 people present. The notes detailed exactly how Marion and Bryce discussed specific properties, specific vulnerable owners, and the exact order in which these transfer agreements should be presented. My name was right there, circled in red ink from 8 months earlier. Lake frontage high priority. Approach after VOS transfer confirmed. I had been on their menu long before Marion ever set foot on my gravel path. But Marion wasn't done playing dirty. Since the fake Article 14B didn't work, she decided to pull a bigger lever. Later that week, a white county truck pulled up to my gate. A guy in a high-vis vest and a clipboard stepped out, walking with the unearned swagger of a mid-level bureaucrat. He introduced himself as a county structural inspector. He said they had received an anonymous tip about unsafe load-bearing modifications to my deck and foundation. He was holding a stack of red tags. He was there to condemn my cabin. Marion had actually called in a favor to get my house red tagged. It was a classic slumlord tactic. Force the owner out, tank the property value, and buy it for pennies. I walked down the steps and met him halfway. I didn't get angry. I just asked for his name, his badge number, and the specific municipal code citations he was claiming I violated. He stumbled, giving me some vague nonsense about visual stress fractures. I smiled. The cold, dead kind of smile. I told him I had spent 3 decades as a commercial construction engineer. I asked him to explain the exact shear strength of the steel brackets I used on those joists. I asked him to calculate the live load capacity of the reinforced concrete footings he was currently standing on. He froze. I pointed up to the motion-activated 4K security camera mounted right under my eaves. I told him he was standing on private property, acting on a fraudulent tip filed by an HOA president currently under criminal investigation, and if he stuck that red tag on my door, my lawyer would own his pension by Friday. He didn't say another word. He turned around, got in his truck, and sped off. That night, the adrenaline was still humming in my veins. I pulled out the county parcel maps again. I was looking for anything I might have missed. A loophole, a boundary dispute, anything I could use to accelerate the legal process. And then I saw it. I zoomed in on the digital map, specifically on the northern side of the HOA office complex. There was a 30-foot strip of land running right along the side of their building, separating their parking lot from the main access road. Everyone in Cedar Lake assumed it belonged to the association. The landscaping crew mowed it. Marion parked her silver sedan right next to it every single day. But the parcel wasn't registered to the HOA. I pulled the master deed. I cross-referenced the tax records. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. The 30-foot strip of land was registered to Douglas Scott, my father. He had bought that tiny, useless strip of frontage from the developer back in 1978 for next to nothing, probably just to ensure nobody ever built a storage shed blocking the road. And when the estate transferred to me, that strip came with it. I legally owned the very ground Marion Chadwick needed to access her own office. Marion thought she owned the board, the rules, and the town. She forgot one crucial detail about the man who built my cabin, and by 6 a.m. on Monday, I was about to make that detail a permanent, steel-reinforced reality. Monday morning arrived cold, windless, and completely still. By 6 a.m., the first heavy-duty truck backed into the access road. I had hired a commercial fencing contractor I'd known for 20 years. I gave him the precise dimensions from my father's 1978 deed and paid a premium for priority installation. At 6:17 a.m., the first steel post was driven deep into the dirt. We weren't building a little wooden picket fence. This was 6-foot, commercial-grade black steel, set in rapid-cure concrete. The building permit was taped clearly to the windshield of the foreman's truck. The parcel was legally mine. The construction was 100% compliant. At exactly 8:04 a.m., Marion's silver sedan turned onto the main access road. By then, an entire third of the fence line was already standing, effectively cutting off the right side of the HOA parking lot and blocking her usual reserved parking space. I watched from the edge of the property line, leaning against the hood of my truck, holding a thermos of coffee. She slammed her car into park right in the middle of the street. She marched toward the crew, her face flushed red, waving her arms and screaming something about unauthorized trespassing and immediate fines. She demanded they stop the cement mixer. The foreman didn't even blink. He just reached into his vest, pulled out a copy of the county permit, and handed it to her. She looked at the paper. She looked at the steel fence. She looked at the registered owner's name printed in bold ink. The sound she made wasn't quite a word. It was the sound of a woman realizing her reality distortion field had just violently collapsed. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, screaming that armed trespassers were destroying community property. 10 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. But they weren't alone. Following right behind them was Dante, an investigative reporter I had tipped off 3 days earlier, carrying a camera. And pulling in last was an unmarked black sedan. A representative from the district attorney's real estate fraud division stepped out. My lawyer, Patricia, had made sure they were invited to the show. The deputies reviewed the permit. They checked the county parcel records on their dash computer. They turned to Marion and confirmed exactly what she did not want to hear. The land was entirely privately owned. The construction was lawful. There was absolutely no legal basis to halt the work. Neighbors started stepping out of their houses. Eleanor Voss walked down the street, clutching her sweater. Greg Salter, the former secretary, stood quietly by the curb. They all watched. At 9:45 a.m., I put my thermos down and walked over. I was carrying 3 thick manila envelopes. I handed one to the senior deputy. I handed one to Dante. I handed the last one to the DA representative. Inside was everything. The recertified surveys. The county clerk's confirmation of the fake Article 14B. Greg's secret meeting minutes. The police report of the break-in at my cabin. The pre-signed transfer agreement left on my table. And the LLC filings explicitly tying Bryce Chadwick to the stolen properties. 114 pages. Tabbed, indexed, and airtight. Marion tried to interrupt. She tried to raise her voice, falling back on her usual weapon of sheer volume. But the DA representative just held up his hand, silencing her without even looking up from the documents. The fence mattered for one specific reason. It made the truth visible. Marion could argue with a neighbor. She could manipulate a closed-door meeting. She could bully an elderly woman like Eleanor. But she could not argue with a recorded county survey, a lawful steel fence, and a prosecutor holding a binder full of her felonies. After that morning, the dominoes fell fast and hard. Patricia formally filed the massive fraud complaint. The sheriff's department escalated the break-in at my cabin to a criminal investigation for burglary and intimidation. Bryce's LLC was hit with a civil investigative demand, and every single one of his business accounts was frozen pending a forensic audit. For weeks after the steel fence went up, Marion Chadwick was let out of her house in handcuffs. She was formally charged with HOA governance fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to obtain property by deception, and criminal facilitation of unlawful entry. Bryce's development fund collapsed overnight. The Cedar Lake Association was forced into a court-ordered board re-election. Turnout was the highest in the neighborhood's history. Eleanor Voss ran, and she won a seat. She called me a week later, her voice steady for the first time since I met her. "I got my backyard back," she said. All 11 of the disputed property transfers were systematically voided by a judge. Late that November, I drove back to the cabin. The air was biting cold, but the lake was perfectly glass-still. My father's fence stood exactly where it belonged, a silent sentinel guarding the boundary. I walked inside. I made a fresh pot of coffee. I straightened the picture frames on the living room shelf. I ran my hand over Catherine's cedar box, resting safely exactly where it was meant to be. The house wasn't empty. It wasn't lonely. It was just peaceful. I sat on the porch, watching the morning light hit the water. Then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from an unknown, untraceable number. There was no name, no greeting, just a set of GPS coordinates and one single sentence. They didn't work alone. I plugged the coordinates into the map. It pointed to another lakeside community, 3 towns over. A new LLC had just been registered there the previous month. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then, I went inside, opened my desk drawer, and pulled out a fresh notebook. Marion never understood the fundamental rule of real estate. A boundary is not just a line drawn in the dirt. It's a map. It's a record. And if you know exactly where the line is, and you have the patience to prove it, eventually, the people trying to cross it are the ones who get trapped.